All right, testing. 1, 2, 3. Hopefully, this is all live and working properly. Hello there, everybody out there. Happy Friday to you, or happy Saturday, depending on what part of the world you are in. It's Friday afternoon for me. My work is wound up for the week. I got a cup of coffee here, and I am ready to do another weekly live stream here, another kind of developer chat. If you missed the first one, last week we tried this out for the first time, kind of impromptu. Doing it a second time here, hopefully a little bit better dialed in with the tech and the environment and all of that. And yeah, basically, if you missed it, the point of this is to hopefully just get a little bit more kind of one-on-one time, hopefully develop more sense of community. And really, I just want to be able to chat a little bit more directly, share some things that I've been getting in the form of questions, things that maybe I've been working on that I think other people might find interesting, and hopefully maybe get a chance to answer some questions and help you all tackle the problems that you're working on right now. So, just like last week, kind of the general outline of this live stream today is going to basically look like this. We're going to have a community question that I had over the last week, something that I think other people might be wondering about and find useful as well. Then we'll talk a little bit about kind of what's new, what I've been looking into this week specifically. We'll take a look at Kotlin Multi-platform a little bit. I gave a talk on that last night, actually. And at some point, I might record some Kotlin multi-platform content and tutorials, but I'm going to give you just kind of a quick overview of what that talk looked like. If you are interested in Kotlin multi-platform and would like to see content related to that on the channel, leave a comment down below and let me know what you'd like to see, and maybe you can work that into the content schedule. And then we're going to jump into another community question. We'll do hopefully some live Q&A if anybody is out there. If you're watching this on the live stream after the fact, feel free to leave a question down below and I'll get back to you as well. Hey, Simon, thanks for joining in. Hey to you as well. Thanks for joining. And then we're going to wrap this up today with kind of the question of the week, which hopefully will just continue to be a conversation starter for everybody, something to kind of get us all chatting, and hopefully, we can maybe come together, help answer people's questions, and learn as a group. Retromania, hey to you as well. Thank you for joining in. So, just like that, we're going to jump into kind of the first main question here. And the first question that I got this past week that I want to talk about is, how do you stay up to date? And I mean, I think this is a pretty prominent question. I think a lot of us struggle with this. I know I do. That's probably one of my biggest challenges in my kind of day-to-day as a software developer, even, 7 years or so into my professional career as a software developer. So I think this is a worthwhile question for us to explore. So the first thing that I'll point out when we can think about how to try and learn it all, or how to stay up to date, is don't try to learn it all. Software in general is moving so fast that it is impossible these days to try and learn it all. More focused to the world of Android, it's still very much true. If we think about how fast Android is changing, every week almost we're getting new updates to Android X and Jetpack libraries. We're getting updates with Kotlin. New patterns are coming out. New devices are coming out and bringing with it form factors and things that we have to update. Every year we're getting new features in the Android framework that we want to try and stay up to date with and support for our users. All of that adds up to really too much for any one person to stay up to date on. And that's why often you don't have a lot of people that are really out there working on the entirety of the Android framework. Even people at Google that many of us might be looking to for advice and mentorship and whatnot are very specific on one area. And if you talk to a lot of them, they'll even say if they had to sit down and write an app today, they might not know where to start because they're so focused in on one area. And I think that's true for a lot of us. So when you're thinking about how you want to stay up to date, maybe reframe it a little bit and don't worry so much about staying up to date on everything, but being able to maybe focus in on a few specific things. And so that kind of brings me to my next point here is when you're thinking about what you want to focus in on and what you want to learn, focus on just trying to learn what you need when you need to learn it. Now, what do I mean here? For example, let's say you've heard a little bit about the Android navigation library. Hey there, Hamza. Thank you for joining in. So let's say you want to learn the Android navigation library. If you don't have a use case for that right away, say in a personal project or even better at work, if you are already working as a developer, then you might not need to focus on learning the Android navigation component right away. What you can do is focus on working on whatever it is that you actually need at the time. Hey there, Asterium. Oh, thanks for joining in. I like the anime icon there. Very nice. So yeah, if you are on a project and you need to come up across a new library or a new architectural pattern or a new testing framework or something like that, that is the best time, I think, to really jump in and dive deep and learn these new frameworks. Now you can stay up to them, or excuse me, you can stay up to date with them, be aware of what's out there so that when you need to go and pick a new tool, you know where it's at. And I think that's a really good way to kind of maximize your learning and to not get too overwhelmed. So staying focused in on what you need for the current task at hand and learning things as you need them. So the next point I want to make in regards to how do you stay up to date is to not just learn what you need when you need it, but also once in a while, try and learn what's interesting to you. And the reason I point out trying to learn what's interesting to you is because I think it's really valuable for us to stay excited and to stay motivated. And one great way to do that is to build things and learn about things that we are excited about. So for me, I really like looking into things related to Kotlin, and I like looking at architecture. So sometimes for me, I have a lot of fun just building up a sample project and trying to see how I can utilize new features, new method calls, work on maybe a new architectural pattern. For some people, they might really be interested in accessibility and in understanding how to better support that for their users. So anything you have like that, maybe it's a game, maybe you want to build like a text-based adventure game on Android or even at the command line. It doesn't always have to be related to whatever your main focus is. But if you can take some time away and learn the things that really excite you, that'll help motivate you to learn the other things that you need as well. And I think that can be incredibly valuable when you think about having longevity in your career and staying excited and not burning out as you're going on. So, all right, yeah. So to kind of just like wrap this up, how do you stay up to date? Just kind of 3 points here throughout. Don't try and learn everything all at once. You can't know it all. One person will never know it all. So it's very okay to focus on the things you need and the things you're interested in. If you really need to go deep and learn something, you can do that at the time that you need it, whether that's for a personal project or a project at work. Those are the best times to really invest a lot of that time and energy. And then finally, don't be afraid to carve out some time in your schedule to learn things specifically because they just interest you or excite you. They don't all have to be going through and checking off lists on a to-do list or a list out there that you might have found that say, these are the things you need to learn to be an Android developer or be a web developer. You have freedom in there to play with and learn the things that excite you as well. And I think, if we can try and do that, it can help us not stay up to date on everything, but to be able to continue to stay current and be refreshing our skills as we go. So with that, I want to jump into kind of the what's new portion of this. And so like I mentioned before, the last couple of weeks here, I have been exploring Kotlin Multi-platform. Excuse me. So Kotlin Multi-platform is a way of building cross-platform applications using Kotlin. And I think it's been really interesting. And so, like I mentioned, I've been exploring this over the last week. And one thing that I have done here. This past week, I wrote a blog post that sort of gives an overview of what Kotlin Multi-platform is. You can find this on my website, goobar.io. You can find that in the link here. It'll also be linked in the description of this video down below. But basically what this does is it just sort of gives you an overview of what it is, what the value proposition is, and some of the just benefits, and a little bit of a look at how this all works. Now, a couple other good resources here. Play.kotlinlang.org has some really nice sort of sample projects and code labs here related to different types of Kotlin projects. And in particular, they have this Introduction to Kotlin Multi-platform project and this Targeting iOS and Android with Kotlin Multi-platform project. And so if you really want to dive more into Kotlin Multi-platform, these are a couple of great resources to start. Another great place to start is this GitHub repo. So this is from TouchLab, and it's their kind of Kotlin multi-platform kit. And this really has some sample projects in here that you can actually look at the code and dive in. But it also has this really awesome README here that talks through kind of the starter app, some educational resources, and it's just a really nice place to start. And in a lot of ways, Kotlin multi-platform is challenged right now because the documentation and the examples and everything are moving so quickly. And honestly, I think this is probably one of the better resources, even when compared to the official documentation. So this is an awesome place to start as well. Now, I want to just take maybe the next 10 minutes or so and kind of give the brief Cliff Notes version of my presentation that I gave last night. So I host a meetup called Mobile Tea Seattle with a couple other colleagues. And last night I spoke and I gave this intro to Kotlin multi-platform talk. And so just a couple questions that often come up, and you might be thinking these when you think of Kotlin multi-platform as well, but is Kotlin cross-platform? Can Kotlin be used for iOS development? Is Kotlin multi-platform production ready? We'll touch on all of these answers here in just a moment. So what is Kotlin multi-platform? I mentioned this briefly already, but basically a Kotlin multi-platform project enables you to share code across your different build targets. So the idea here is that you could write a kind of a common or shared library, put some common logic, some architectural patterns, maybe some model classes, things like that, and then reuse those in different applications. So how is this code sharing achieved? Well, so you have a couple different ways here. So things that don't really need to change depending on your platform, they can just live in your common folder. So maybe that is a URL to a particular backend API. That could just live in that common module. Then Kotlin multi-platform projects introduce these expect and actual keywords, which essentially enable us to say, hey, when you get to compilation and runtime, you can expect that I'm going to have an implementation of this class. Then the actual implementation of that lets you define that however you need to for a specific platform. Now, if that sounds a little confusing, we'll clear that up in a moment with a code example. And then the last kind of way we can share code here is through just regular interfaces. We can define interfaces for behaviors, and then we can compose those as needed to basically abstract away any platform-specific implementation details. There we go. So here's an example of the expect keyword. So in our common module, we might say that we expect this declaration of a platform object, and that object will have a property called name. So this is pretty straightforward. And so now from anywhere else in our common code, we can refer to platform and platform.name and expect that that code will be there at compilation time for every build target. So now in our specific build targets, in this case, Android and iOS, we use the actual keyword to basically provide the platform-specific implementation of that platform object declaration. So in this case, when we define platform for the Android framework, we provide the Android string as our name, and on iOS, we provide the string iOS. And now when we reference platform.name on each of those, we will get the proper platform-specific name of Android or iOS. Now, this is what a general kind of project structure looks like for Kotlin Multi-platform. So we have some common modules here at a lower level. Then for each build target, we have kind of another set of source code there specific to each of those targets. So we have, Android main, Android test, iOS main, iOS test, and those depend on that common code. And then for each of our actual applications, in this case, Android app and our iOS app, we can consume those platform-specific build build sources, and we can use those to build our app as we would any other application. And we can do this beyond mobile as well. So we could use this shared code in the browser using a Kotlin JS project in the browser. We could also target the JVM in general and build a server and write our server code using this common framework. So it's really quite flexible. Now, we'll go ahead and jump into a demo here. So I'll open up IntelliJ. All right, cool. Looks like I've got IntelliJ. Excellent. So this is IntelliJ. This is where I have been building this sample Kotlin multi-platform project. And then just a few things I want to point out. So you'll notice here in the project pane that we have an Android app, a backend app, a browser app, we have our iOS app, and then we have this common module right here. So if I open up this common module and I go to source, we'll see then that I have different source sets for each of these sort of target platforms. So I've got Android right here, common, iOS, JS, and JVM. If we go into the common code here, we can see this sample of the platform object declaration. And we also see this hello function that is making use of that platform object declaration. That hello function is a public top level function that will be available in all of our build targets. So if we actually go into, let's say, our Android code here, we'll go into main activity. We've included that common module up here where we see sample.hello. We've imported that hello function. And now we've called that hello function and used that to update our text in this Android app. So now if I go ahead and run this, which will take just a second here. Okay, let me switch over to show off the emulator. There we go. So it doesn't do much, but you can see it's saying hello from Android. So it's pulling in the platform-specific implementation of that, but we're calling a method that was just defined in the common code. So that's pretty cool because it's allowed us to sort of like define the strategy, define the general implementation of that method, but defer to the platform-specific implementation where needed. Now we can do the same thing for some of these other targets here. So on our backend code, I've written this simple Ktor server running on the JVM target. And once again, I've imported sample.hello. And so now here, if I simply run this, this server, I can see that I'm going to be pulling in the JVM target. So in this case, I'll run this backend run task. And once that is completed, I'll open this up into the browser, which there we go. And so there, now you can see hello from JVM. So in this case, it was pulling in that sample code from the JVM build target. So come back over to IntelliJ. And so we could do the same thing for the browser target with JavaScript. We won't show the full example here, but we'll just show that once again, are defining a main function here in the Kotlin JS project. We've imported the hello function from our common code, and we are writing that out to the DOM using some of the built-in Kotlin X functionality there. And then likewise, we could do it in iOS as well, but I won't run through that. But you can kind of get the point here that we are able to really share that code across all of these different build targets, which is really nice. It lets us encapsulate a lot of interesting things. So real quick, what platforms can we target with this? Well, we just saw you can do JVM and Android. We saw JavaScript. We saw iOS. You can also do macOS, watchOS, tvOS. And then other native targets such as WebAssembly, Windows, Linux, and even some things like embedded systems. So what is the value proposition here? Why is this useful? Well, it lets you share code, very specific code, without having to cover the entire surface area of a target platform like Android or Windows or Linux. So that's beneficial. It lets us share code at a very high level language that feels very similar to Swift or JavaScript. And it's easy to swap out this common code if it's not solving your problem. It's not an all or nothing approach. That's pretty neat. Yes, I agree. I think it is pretty neat. I don't know. I think it's an interesting take on it. We'll see a little bit what some of the drawbacks are here in a second, but I agree. It's neat. So how is this different? How is this different specifically from things like React Native or Flutter? Well, again, Kotlin Multi-platform, it's not an all or nothing approach. Both React Native and Kotlin, you can use them within an existing application, but it's much harder to do so. They really work best when it's all React Native or it's all Flutter or it's, say all Xamarin. And so Kotlin Multi-platform is kind of the opposite. It's never going to be all or nothing. It doesn't try to replace your native tooling. It doesn't try to replace your native UI. It's really meant to be built as kind of a third-party library that you then consume and share. Let's see. We have a question here. Is there a way of getting Kotlin used in more places than Android? Do you think it will work? So, that's kind of like jumping to the punchline a little bit, but yes, it definitely works. In particular, like we know it works on Android, but Kotlin works wonderfully on the JVM as well, since that's essentially its default target. And so because of that, it works really well today on the back end. And I know there are people out there that are using Kotlin for back-end services. At my current job, we have kind of a back-end service that's not in production at the moment, but it is all written in Kotlin and works and everything. And I think more and more people might start to come online with the idea of using Kotlin for back-end services. And there's frameworks out there like Ktor, Quarkus, HTTP 4K. If you're interested in Kotlin for backend, I actually have a couple of videos up on the YouTube channel from the last couple of weeks. You can take a look at those to kind of point you to where to get started. Beyond using Kotlin for Android or Kotlin for, let's say, the JVM server-side code, I think it is going to be more of a challenge. In particular, using it for native targets, so like any of the Apple, Mac, iOS things, or like Windows and Linux. It's still a challenge right now because the tooling for those isn't 100% in place yet. In particular, debugging into these native frameworks that are generated becomes a challenge. So that's one part, is that the developer experience isn't quite seamless yet on that end. Another challenge is going to be getting buy-in from people, in particularly, if you're trying to get buy-in from your iOS team to, want to share some code that's written in a language that they might perceive as being an Android-specific language, there might be some friction there. And that's something that I think people that are fans of Kotlin Multi-platform, they're going to have to wrestle with and kind of understand what the right way to propose this approach is. I think the community behind it is also going to need some really good use cases of like how this helped people and why it worked when other approaches might not have. So while I think like technically it's ready today for some targets and it's really close for others, I think there's still sort of like an organizational mindset shift that's going to have to happen before we see like a lot of wide adoption from this Kotlin multi-platform approach. But that's a really good question. I was just having essentially that same conversation with a couple different people last night after my talk at my meetup. So let's see if I can go back to the presentation here. All right, so like I mentioned, actually, I just talked a couple of the limitations, but documentation, tutorials, and everything, they're very quickly evolving as the tooling's changing. So some of this stuff's out of date. It's hard to know exactly where to start. The Kotlin native debugging and kind of some multi-threading challenges, they're still present, but they're getting very close. There is a plugin, I think it's in the works, to help make debugging into the native code easier. Multi-threaded coroutine support on the native side is, I think, like in draft form or PR form. It's very close as well. Once those things are a little bit more solved, the third-party ecosystem should get better as well. That will make it a lot easier to jump in and start building. So I think over the next year, this is going to start to become much more viable for targets beyond Android and the JVM. All right, so where to start? I already pointed out the TouchLab GitHub repo, which is great. The Kotlin Conf app is open source. You can take a look at that and see how they built that. That includes mobile and their website, I think. The DroidCon app is also a resource there. There's some other third-party libraries out there. I won't go into them too much, but there is third-party support out there for common things like databases and settings. I mentioned the tutorials already. Yeah, my book, I talk about kind of how to set up a multi-platform project in my book, which you can find a link to down below. But honestly, the book doesn't go super in depth, but it does help you get started and kind of understand how the project is structured. Okay, so that is enough of that. So yeah, that's kind of Kotlin multi-platform in a very quick, high-level nutshell, but it's something that I'm pretty interested in. So I'm curious, if you think Kotlin multi-platform is neat or interesting, you want to hear more, again, let me know in the comments down below, and kind of what questions you might have, what things you'd like to see me talk about in the future. In particular, if you think it'd be interesting to see kind of like a project structure and setup, or how to set up a simple Kotlin multi-platform project. I think that would be interesting, but it is time consuming, so I don't want to bore everybody if nobody actually is interested in that. All right, so let's jump back over here into our outline, and we're going to jump into kind of a second community question, which I got over this past week, and that was, how do you collaborate on remote teams? And this was a very interesting question. So for those maybe not familiar, I have been working remote now for 3.5 years. And so I have a pretty good sense of, things that work and things that don't work when working remotely. And not just remotely, but like fully distributed. My current team, we are spread all across the US. On my last team, I was collaborating with a developer in India as well as a developer in California, and I was in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, Washington. So I've had experience kind of working with people all over the place. And I do think like there's some very specific things that you can do that really help how teams can collaborate in that environment. There we go. So the first big important key here, and I think this really is a mindset shift for like the whole organization as well, but transparency becomes key. You really want to communicate. You want to over communicate. You want to make sure everyone is on the same page. They know why decisions are being made. You want to make sure people know what you're working on. And just in general, you want to try and make sure people feel included. And the reason this is important is because if you don't sort of go out of your way to be transparent and to communicate in ways that might feel almost like you're over communicating at first, people will very quickly start to feel like they're in the dark and like they don't know what's going on, which then leads to feeling isolated and maybe less motivated. So it's very important to check those boxes and make sure you're keeping people engaged by being transparent with decisions and things like that. Now, how do you kind of go about being transparent? Well, the first way you can really go about that is to document everything. And so this means documenting meeting notes, decisions that were made in meetings, documenting your tasks for a sprint or for a session, documenting brainstorming ideas, documenting things like, just chat that you maybe had while you were in a one-on-one meeting, and maybe a couple of fun ideas were thrown out there. The more you can document and have, well-known, easy to find locations for these types of things, the easier it will be to people to stay up to date after the fact. My current team, we use Basecamp to document all this stuff, and it's very easy to find where all of this stuff lives because we're just very good. We have systems in place, and certain types of things get documented in certain places, and we get the notifications for certain types of updates, and it just helps keep everybody on the same page. And you can do this, whether you're a single solo developer, you can document things in maybe a GitHub wiki page, in Trello, in Google Docs. You could do it in open source projects as well, even if there's only maybe a couple people working together. You can document decisions for the types of architecture that you can make. You can document what the project goals and milestones are. All of that stuff really helps to keep people on the same page when they're spread out across location and time. Let's see here. Sorry, lost my button there for a second. So embrace async communication is the next tip I have on how to effectively collaborate on a remote team, whether kind of in work or open source. Embracing async communication means, not expecting immediate answers for everything. An example of this is Slack. When we ping people in Slack, we typically expect a message back pretty quickly. Async communication is kind of the opposite. Oftentimes when I'm communicating with my team, I send a message out and I might not expect a response back for a few hours or even maybe a day or two. The expectation is that if things are really crucially, vitally important, that you maybe will send a direct message, which kind of elevates the importance of that. But for most things, we understand that they aren't super high priority and we can afford to wait a while. And so for those types of things, you can develop a culture and an expectation that, hey, I will get back to you when I have free time, but that might not be for a few hours. And at first, this starts to feel very foreign, especially if you're used to, lots of chatter throughout the day. But in my experience, people tend to get very overwhelmed and spend so much time in meetings or Slack messaging each other that they don't have time to get work done. So by embracing async communication, you have more time to get stuff done. You have more time to focus on what you deem is most important at the time, not what other people are bombarding you about. And it lets people kind of be continuously working and hopefully not get as blocked on dependencies waiting to hear back from other team members. All right. And so I think, so last 2 points here. So this one is pretty quick, but using video chat when you can really helps. So if you have a meeting about something and you want to brainstorm some ideas, or you have like a one-on-one or a review with your manager, being on a video call helps a lot. Getting to see people face to face, reading body language, body expressions, all that stuff, it really helps. So if you have the bandwidth, if you're in a good quiet location, jumping on video can be a great way to have more direct real-time communication with people. And then this last one here is set clear expectations. And this is a good approach just in general when working on a team. But again, setting expectations around when am I going to be working? How often am I going to respond to you? What am I going to need in the coming week? Am I going to have blockers? Just trying to let people know where you're at and what you're going to expect and need from them to get the job done. The more clear the expectations, the more on the same page everyone is about how often to communicate, where to communicate, what to communicate. That makes getting the work done much easier. And it might sound like a lot, it might sound complicated at first, but what I have found is that once you're kind of used to that, you actually spend far less time communicating. You spend far less time waiting on meetings, waiting on people's input. And you get to spend just more time, learning, more time writing code, more time actually doing the work that you enjoy. So I think all of those things are huge benefits. All right. So that's it for kind of the 2 community questions that came up for me this week. Like I said, if you have a question, feel free to send it to me throughout the week, and maybe I'll answer it. Well, I'll definitely answer it directly, but I might also bring it up and talk about it on the live stream if it's something I think that will help everybody. Now, let's see. We'll look at the chat here because I think we do have a couple questions maybe. So we already kind of answered this question right here of, can we get Kotlin working in other places? And that one I think, is yes, technically, but it might be a challenge organizationally and the mindset shift that needs to go along with it. Let's see here. This comment here from Retromania. So Go developer here. Kotlin is interesting. Made me explore Android a bit. It seems to be using a lot of Java libraries and patterns, which is a turnoff for outsiders. I think that's fair. Because Kotlin is a JVM-based language, there is a lot of overlap there. It's going to feel very similar in terms of some of those libraries and stuff it's using. That said, like I think it's also very similar to Swift, and it's also very similar to JavaScript in a lot of ways. And so, I think the level of familiarity or how much maybe that turns you off maybe depends a bit on where you're coming from. I know I found like when I learned Kotlin, I was able to finally read and understand my iOS team's code base. So in that sense, that like I thought it was close enough that I was actually now better able to understand, Swift, which is a very non-JVM, non-Android language. So, I do think there's something to that, because it's very JVM like in many ways, that might turn you off. But I think on the flip side, it has a lot of similarities to other useful popular languages. So, I don't know too much more to say. I think people in general, some people are going to hate certain languages, some people are going to love them. I think that's the nature of it. But in general, I think Kotlin is a very nice language. It's been awesome for Android, and I think it's also going to be great for other things as well. So thank you for that question. Let's see. Ethan, Ethan, hey, thanks for tuning in, man. Thanks for joining. So Ethan asks, when coding as an Android developer, how do you decide on implementing new things or sticking with the old? So there's probably a couple different ways this could be taken, but so I'm assuming like, how do you decide on whether to maybe refactor or like use new and existing tools versus sticking with what you know? And that is a good question. I think that's always kind of it's a balance that we have to make. I think as developers, we tend to be curious. And so a lot of times we want to go and try and explore the new things. But we also, I think, should be pragmatic to some extent. And so we want to make sure that we're using tools that we're familiar with and we know work and are stable and all of that. So it is a balance. And I think this balance, in some ways, is going to be informed by the team and the organization that you're in. If you're working at a startup, there's likely going to be a lot more leeway um, and room for you to try new and exciting things because there's probably going to be a little less formality, probably smaller team as well. So it's easier to be really fast and try those new things, to rewrite things as you go. That's kind of just the nature of being on a small kind of startup-y team. On the flip side, if you're in a really large established company, or maybe just a company that moves a bit slower, it's going to be harder to do that. I've been on both teams. I've been on a team where we could pull in the newest libraries and everything as often as we wanted. And I was on a team where we would have to get like approval for such things. And we had to really talk to like all the devs on the team and get buy-in before we tried something new. So, I think the biggest thing is to, check in with the team, see how other people on the team are feeling. And also, I think it's good to, stay up to date and try and bring new things in where you see fit, but also recognize that we do want to make sure our applications are stable and reliable. So I can give an example of my own experience of what maybe not to do. When Work Manager came out, we integrated Work Manager when it was still in alpha, and that ended up being a huge mistake. We had tried a couple of the other libraries in alpha and they'd worked fine, but Work Manager, we ran into a huge bug, led to tons of crashes for our user, and it took several releases to fix it. Like even the Google engineers that we were working with to help us, like they kept having to give us new fixes because there was just this really nasty bug. So in that sense, like we probably should have been a little bit more cautious, not been so eager to try the new thing, and waited till it to be a little bit more stable. So I would say that's the advice. Try and balance, the needs of your users, your consumers, with your desire to try the new stuff. And last thing on this, I guess, is but if you're in a sample project, it doesn't matter. If you're in a little sample project or a personal project, I would say try anything and everything you want. But if you're building an application for people, keep in mind the stability and the user experience for sure. That's a good question. That's something we all deal with all the time. Okay, yeah, so I think that's roughly what we answered here. So with new libraries in Kotlin, when do you stop embedding new language speakers and libs, and where do you decide they should evolve your code base? So I think the evolution of the code base is something that you want to try and kind of have going at all the time. So as you're coming back to a feature, maybe think about, how can I clean this code up a bit? How can I prove this here and there? Is it time to maybe apply a new pattern here? Again, it takes checking in with your team to see what level of time and effort you can put into something, what level of risk is acceptable to do a big refactor versus like the small update. But in general, I think as we go through a code base, a good rule of thumb is to try and leave the code cleaner, more stable, better tested than when we found it. So sometimes that might mean refactoring an entire screen and updating from scratch, but oftentimes that might mean small little incremental changes as we go. And each time you touch a file, if you can make it a little bit better, then over time, the quality of the code base will improve as well. All right, so one more question here. If you're working with a client, do you set these boundaries you were talking about in writing or just discuss over email or phone? So this would be in context to kind of setting boundaries and expectations when you're working remotely. And I think that is a really good question. Actually, I'm just going to throw that back up there one more time. So how do you set and communicate these boundaries? I think if you're working with a client, um, like having that in writing, I think is not a bad idea. I mean, I definitely think, communicating that face to face or at least over a video chat would be a good idea, but also putting that into writing to some extent is probably a good idea so that they know from the get-go what to expect from you. And it should go both ways. Like they might really need a certain level of, communication or availability from you. And so you'll want to try and find that middle ground where both parties are happy. But definitely, I think having that in writing is probably going to be a good idea because, as bandwidth or expectations change in one party, you want to be able to have something to go back to kind of, protect yourself and set that clear expectation. No, this is what we agreed upon. If we need to retalk or update this agreement, we can do that, but it should be very explicitly spelled out. And that's just going to make for a better work environment for everybody, I think. All right, Rakib asks, how do you approach keeping up with new frameworks and practices when you're busy at work on a relatively older, more rigid project at work while minimizing time spent coding outside of work? Yes, so that goes perfectly back to the question of how do you stay up to date that we were talking about at the beginning. How do you approach keeping up with the new frameworks practices when you're busy working on kind of an older project? So I think the expectation here is that if it's an older project, you're probably not getting opportunities to work on those new things and implement them as a part of the project. So that makes it harder to learn the things as you go. And then you want to protect the time that you spend outside of work. We don't want to spend all of our time coding all the time, and we shouldn't have to. Like you shouldn't have to be working 80 hours a week between home and work to stay up to date. And so I mean, the first thing I would say here is again, sometimes we can like reevaluate what it means to stay up to date, like how many things we're actually actively using and trying. Because again, because so much stuff's coming out, we often feel overwhelmed. Especially, if you go to a conference and you see 20 talks about all these new things, it makes it feel like everybody is out there learning all these things, which is not the case. So in some sense, I think we can give ourselves a little bit of freedom to not always be so up to date. I think that's perfectly okay. Another thing that I think is good to do, maybe the viability probably depends a little bit on the team, but I think it's very valid and reasonable as an engineer to carve into your work week time to stay up to date on things. So, like some of the bigger companies, they might be the idea of like 20% time, where 20% of your week you can spend doing, a side project or learning a new thing or working on something else. That's something that I've tried to kind of build into my work just in general. I think, at certain points I've sort of had conversations with managers about, hey, is it okay that I do this? I think as I've grown in my career, been in my career for longer, it's something that I've just started to carve out for myself. Even if it's just a couple hours a week, scheduled into my regular work time. And that might be like a sample project or a little sandbox app, or just I can take a little bit of time, work on implementing a new thing, work on pulling in a new library, playing with a testing approach, things like that. I think that's a nice, happy medium. It's a way to avoid too much time outside of work, but also a way to make sure that you have that learning time if you're not getting it so much in the actual project and the code that you're working on. If you have questions about whether that would be okay, I think having that conversation with a manager is a great idea. Hopefully, that manager is going to see that value and be very okay with that. And if they are, and they do give you that approval, then that gives you sort of that free pass to feel very comfortable in that. That's kind of what I did in my very first job out of school, and it ended up working out great for everybody because I was able to learn new things and then bring them back to the team, and then the team was able to better utilize those. So that could be one way for you to pitch it. You could, tell them or mention to them how by you learning, it's going to improve the team, and you can maybe see where best practices or things like that could be updated. But yeah, that's a challenge. Good luck with that. I'd love to hear what other people are doing for this. How are they staying up to date? How are they carving out that time during the week to stay up to date on this stuff? That's a great question. Thank you. All right, let's see here. Another question from Ethan. So, what other Android libraries would you say are not ready for use but are pushed out by the Android team? Compose, Camera X, what draws that line for you? That is an awesome question. In fact, if I go back over to Chrome here, so that was actually essentially what this article I wrote a few weeks ago. So this is again on my website, goobar.io. But I wrote this article called How Stable is Stable Enough? Which hopefully will load up here in a second. Basically, how stable is stable enough? Should you use non-stable library versions? And basically, the whole point of this blog post was to talk about this question of can you use alphas? Can you use beta? Should you use stable only? And again, I think this depends a lot on the context. So if you're on a personal project, again, if it's just a little side thing, use whatever you want. I don't think it matters too much. If you are shipping something out to real users where you want to have that be stable and not crash, I think it's a good rule of thumb to avoid anything that's pre-release for sure. I should clarify pre-release. So anything that's like a developer preview, which Compose right now, Jetpack Compose is still in like a developer preview state. So avoid anything like that. I think it's also a good rule of thumb to avoid alphas, just because they're still a bit early. And like I said, I have been burned by that before. So I think avoiding alphas is a good idea. Betas, particularly betas from Google, have been pretty stable. I haven't had a lot of issues with them. And so I think for the most part, using a beta from like the Android X library is probably okay, especially if it's one of the more popular ones, like the navigation architecture component, work manager. I think those are really good. Certainly stable, full RC candidates, all that, those are going to be good. If you're using a library that's not from Google, for example, we want to definitely kind of apply some caution and some critical thinking there, because it does matter where it's coming from. If the library is coming from a developer that you've never heard of before, there's not a lot of stars on the repo or anything, I wouldn't trust an alpha or a beta. I would stick to the stable in general. If it's coming from somebody like Square, where their team has built many, many high quality libraries, yeah, in that case, I'm probably more likely to accept something like a beta release because I just trust them. And if it's a library with a lot of stars, you hear people talking about it and they've had success with it, I think that makes sense as well. Oh, excuse me. So like Ethan, again, in his question mentioned specifically Jetpack Compose. That one is definitely not ready. I don't think anybody should be using Compose in production right now. Play with it in sample projects for sure, just to learn it and get used to where they're going with the API. But I don't think it's production ready yet. Camera X, I honestly don't know much about Camera X. I haven't had a chance to use it, so I would kind of defer to those general guidelines I mentioned of, alpha, pre-release, no, beta, probably okay, stable, definitely okay. Let's see. So, okay, yeah, we keep just again comment, great point, having conversation with your manager regarding work on a Sandboard project. Yep, I think that is great. It kind of goes back to those guidelines I mentioned for remote work, but like communication is key. And that is the same whether you're remote or in person. If you can have a really good working relationship and be very open with your manager, it's going to be a better work environment for everybody. Now, I recognize that oftentimes you might not have a manager that you feel you can be open with. And that's a tough position to be in. But try and maybe approach that. If it doesn't work, maybe, reach out to somebody, think about how you might word it differently, approach it differently, and maybe try it again sometime. And, eventually if you find that your team or your manager just isn't open to you, learning new things or carving out some time to learn something, that might be a case where you might want to start to consider whether you could find a new role that is going to be more open to sort of your growth as a developer, and, open to you sort of growing in your career in that way. Oh man, my throat is getting tired from talking. Thank you everybody for all the questions. I love this. This is the type of stuff why I think the live stream is fun and would love to keep doing it. Um, if there are any other questions, we could wait another, like minute or two here, and, answer more questions that come through. Again, if you're watching this after the fact, if you have a question, please feel free to leave it in the comments down below. I would love to, answer that and chat through that, or hit me up on social media. Twitter is generally the best to get a hold of me. But yeah, always love to hear questions and see what other people are struggling with. Honestly, I find a lot of times we're all struggling with the same stuff. And so the more we can talk about it and talk about strategies and stuff for dealing with it, I think it's helpful for everybody. So as we're waiting another maybe a minute or two for kind of questions to come in here, kind of go into the last little part of the live stream format here, which is a question of the week. And so this is just a question to throw out there for all of us, to hopefully just chat and again see kind of what others are dealing with and what's helped. So this week, the question is just, what's the biggest challenge in software development for you right now? What is the thing that's been hard? What are you trying to overcome? Leave a comment down below in the comment section of the video in the live chat. But yeah, what's been the big challenge for you? I think for me lately, the big challenge has been, again, trying to like manage the things that I really am interested in personally and how to blend that with what I'm currently working on at work. It's not to say I don't like what I'm working on at work, it's just it's a little bit different. And so like we mentioned in some of the questions earlier, like how can you carve out that space? It can be a challenge, especially when you have, life, you maybe you're trying to exercise and stay mentally and physically fit, spend time with, a significant other, your dog, your pets, your friends, all that. It is challenging. And so that's kind of been my struggle, is just making sure I'm keeping everything in balance while also developing my technical skills as an engineer. Okay, yeah, we got a couple more questions. That's awesome. So yeah, one more time before we jump into more questions. But yeah, question of the week, what's your biggest challenge in software development right now? Like I said, I would love to throw out suggestions if I have them. Other people, if you have suggestions for people's questions, throw those down there as well, and let's kind of help each other out. But yeah, another question here. Do you use MVVM? If yes, where do you put the business logic? So yeah, that's a good question. So yes, I tend to use MVVM. And I mean, MVVM in general, there's a lot of ways of implementing MVVM these ways. And particularly like in the Android world, I think it's been muddied a little bit up because of the fact that like the Android architectural view model, it's like that name sort of doesn't quite fit what we view as MVVM in a lot of ways. But as a general practice, the kind of version of MVVM that I've been using for a while now and have found helpful is using kind of the architectural component view model as kind of the controller. This is where we're putting a lot of the business logic. So within this view model for a screen, that tends to be where we inject repositories here. So our repositories are going out, fetching our data. Within that, I've been tending to use sort of like a reactive approach lately. So it was RxJava for a while, did some live data, and now we're moving more into a Kotlin flow approach. But so pulling in these different repository data sources, kind of combining those together using like a combine operator, and then transforming that data as needed, and then essentially exposing a view state. Now, the view state might be just a data class. It could also be a sealed class that maybe represents like a success case, an error case, a loading case, which is kind of a common pattern. And then we've been using essentially two flows to represent actions and view state. So we have one flow basically that just represents the view state. So anytime a new view state, which again is sort of an immutable data object representing what is actually on the screen, that gets exposed to the fragment or the activity, whatever kind of UI layer component you want. And then on that UI layer, each time we get a new update from that flow, we bind the UI. For events, such as, a one-time thing like showing a toast or, showing an animation, we have another flow that is specifically just for these one-time events. So on that flow, we don't want to kind of remember that, because if like an orientation change occurs or some other configuration change, we don't want to re-show that. So that's something that we can configure in our flow to make sure that we're not remembering that state. And then on the other side, coming from the UI, we basically convert any input on like a view, we convert that into an associated sealed class object that represent things like, on sign in clicked. That gets sent back to the view model, which then essentially kicks off another loop of performing some action, maybe going out to an API call, and then that's eventually going to get converted back into either an event or a view state update. So it's similar almost to MVI, but not quite as much sort of boilerplate and not quite so much rules around just sort of like the structure of how you put things together. Hopefully that helps. But I guess like kind of back to the original question again, like the business logic that, for the most part has been in, our view model. And then we kind of we have a distinction between the view model and like a view state, which is what actually gets bound to the UI. Good question. One more, Kirsten. Awesome. I love this. We have more questions. That's great. So is there a good place to learn all the different stuff and when to use them? I talked about MVVM. Oh, let's throw that back up one more time. I'm talking about MVVM and the other acronyms. So trying to think if there's one single place. So the one place that comes to mind for MVVM and some of the other like UI architecture patterns specifically. So that's things like MVVM, MVP, MVI, MVC. There is a Google repo that walks through some of these architectural blueprints. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Google Arch Blueprints. Okay, yeah, I think I found it here. So yeah, so this repo here called Android/architecture samples. Yeah, I believe if this is the one I'm thinking of, it has a bunch of different branches here. Yeah, so it has different branches representing different ways of sort of building your Android app. So, as we see, we have examples here for how to implement Dagger Android, data binding, MVVM with live data, MVVM with RX Java. Let's see, what else we have in here? Some to-dos for like MVP examples. So that at least covers MVP and MVVM. It doesn't cover all of them. Those are probably, two of the top three that I hear talked about right now. For MVI, I don't know of like a really good place for MVI, although there are some pretty good talks out there from conferences the last couple years. DroidCon Boston 2019 had a couple good talks on it. I think there was one at Android Summit, not Android Dev Summit, but just Android Summit from last August. So that's probably an okay place to start learning more about MVI. Man, I feel like I'm forgetting something. Maybe if I remember, I'll try and leave a comment later down below in the comments. But yeah, it is kind of hard to find like a single resource to learn all of these different patterns. And I also, I guess, I'll point out too, like when we think about MVVM, that's really just the UI layer, like how to get sort of like combine the data and put it into the UI. So there's also just larger architecture as a whole of like, how do we manage, A/B tests? How is our authentication flows? How are we going to navigate between screens? How are we going to collect or like have account data? How are we going to store things in our database? There's all these other parts that go into the architecture as well. Some of those larger things you could also start to understand and learn a bit more about from this architecture samples repo that Google has, because they do talk about some of that stuff. And then also just general, another general good resource, but the book Clean Code, which you can find on Amazon. This is another one that I think a lot of people look to in ways of like structure and kind of architect their code bases. Very good resource there that a lot of people tend to recommend. So yeah, there's kind of a lot of different places out there. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's one like a great resource to just learn everything. And honestly, like that would be really challenging. Maybe the closest thing to that we've had is Udacity's like Android program, but even that really didn't get much into things like MVVM or MVP. So yeah, it's just kind of a hard problem right now, unfortunately. Another question from Rakib here. So regarding Android development, have you been at a crossroads where you wanted to specialize on build engineering, UI, or just continue with app development? What has helped clarify this? So yeah, I think in my career, I've gone through multiple sort of different states where like for a long time, I really wanted to, so you really focused on like the UI. I really loved, trying to like make things look great. This was right around when material design came out. So like UI was really fresh and exciting. So I really wanted to see like, how can we implement this new material design guideline? How can we make things visually appealing? How can we make it easier for engineers to implement these UI designs? How can we add animation? So like there was a while where like I was really focused in on that. I think there was another, well, actually currently I'm sort of in this period where I've been really into like the build systems, continuous integration, continuous deployment. How do we automate tasks and make kind of that process of just continually shipping good software easier and more seamless? And so I think like it's really common for us to go through those phases. And so like I don't know if I have a lot of like hard advice here other than if you find yourself really gravitating one way or the other, I don't think there's anything wrong with you to lean into that. If you really want to be like a UI focused developer, I don't think there's an issue with that, particularly if you still, know how to build an application. I think that's like the one risk that we have is if we go so far into one area that we no longer know kind of enough to like actually sit down and build a simple app. I don't think we have to know at all times how to build like a complicated app, but I think of like if you're sitting down in an interview and had to do a take-home test, and a lot of times those take-home tests are basically here's a weather API. How do you pull today's weather or data from the API and show it in a list, and then maybe have a detail view? If you can keep that in your mind, which isn't too hard to do, then yeah, focus on things, focus on builds, focus on CI, testing, UI. Those are actually great ways to help differentiate yourself when looking for jobs. And it's also a great way, if you want to give talks or blog posts or things like that, which again can then help you, get your name out there and get jobs and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think specializing can be great. And again, it goes back to what I talked about at the beginning. If you really are interested in something like UI and like material design, spending time on that is going to get you excited and it's going to help keep you motivated and help avoid burnout, which is awesome. So let's see, more questions here. One dev, look who's streaming. Yes, I likewise. I saw you streaming earlier today when I was pretty much getting prepared for my stream. Great minds think alike, maybe. So Hamza here asks, what skills are expected from junior and senior Android developers? Yeah, this is a great question. So I think this is going to depend a little bit on, again, the team, the organization. For me, like when I've hired in the past, I've been looking at the junior level. I've been looking for someone that they know kind of the core fundamentals of Android. They know what an activity is. They know what a fragment is. They kind of know what the manifest is used for. They have a general idea, sort of like what goes into like your Gradle files. They can explain to me, how I might start to think about building a very simple UI. How am I going to get button clicks? How am I going to navigate from one screen to the next? What is an intent, and maybe what are different types of intents, an explicit intent versus an implicit intent. um, how is one, like, how might you go about performing work on the background thread? What is an ANR uh, kind of what is an ANR issue in your app, and how would you go about diagnosing that? What might that mean? Um, those are the types of questions, basically things that show that you've actually been working with Android for a while, things that you should run into pretty quickly if you try building a simple app. And then, like, if I'm doing a take-home test for like a junior level developer, I would expect someone to be able to, take, make an API request, show that data in like a simple recycler view, and then probably navigate to another screen. It wouldn't have to look great. It wouldn't necessarily have to be architected really well, but like that's the type of functionality that I would expect for like a junior level. Now at the senior level, what I would expect is, you're gonna start wanting having more of those like architecture patterns in place. So if you go back to that same example, we might have the same requirements, but the level of like architecture and the cleanness of the code would be much better. I would expect people to be able to tell me why they implemented things a certain way, why you chose maybe RX Java over live data, or why you choose Flow over RX Java, things like that. At the senior level, I would expect to be able to have a conversation around, testing and testing approaches and how to make our code more testable. I might expect to be able to have a conversation around, CI or the build system, some things maybe more specific to the types of things they've talked about specializing in on their resume. Um, at a senior level, I think being able to give more depth. So instead of a question like, how might you do work on a background thread? It might be, what are multiple ways you can do work on a background thread? And what are the pros and cons? Like, when would you want to just spin up a new thread to do some work versus when would you want to use Work Manager? What would be the pros and cons of integrating RX Java into your code base? How might you go about diagnosing a very tricky bug? How would you go about implementing an A/B test? All of these things, kind of that next level of what goes into really taking an app from a viable, sustainable, maintainable product. Those are the types of things that I would start to expect a lot more of at that mid and senior level. Let's see. Go back here. Awesome. Got more questions. All right. So one dev here. Which streaming software do you use for that question pop up? Very nice. Yeah, I agree. So this is like just the last couple weeks I've been trying this. This is Ecamm Live that I've been using for the live stream here. It's a paid service. I'm not sure how long I'll be using it, but it does have a trial. And so far I'm really liking it. It's made this stream pretty easy to set up. So yeah, good recommendation there. 2 thumbs up for that. Juan here, you want to be the next Nick Butcher for a while? That is very true. I did, and Nick Butcher's like posts on design and all that have been amazing over the years, and I've definitely referenced those many times. Let's see. Benny here asks, what would you say are 3 main things Android dev has to know, like unit test or DI? Oh man, that's a good question. It's so hard because there's so many things. 3 main things. So honestly, like you mentioned, like unit test or DI, like those are those are good things, and maybe up at like that senior level, those could start to be like another list. But like at the very basics, I think just how do you build like a UI? How do you get different types of things on the screen? How do I show like a list of data? How do I compose a UI in certain ways? Like I think there's a lot that goes into that, and how to do that efficiently. How to use like constraint layout, for example, I think would be a big benefit for that these days. How do you navigate between screens properly? How do you kind of structure going from an activity to an activity, or how do you go from fragment to a fragment, and kind of when to use one or the other? What are the trade-offs? And then I think like how do you do work on a background thread? I think that's another like very critical one. And what are some of the different ways to do that? And again, what are the trade-offs for those? I think those are sort of like the three things that like as soon as you jump into building a real app, like those are the things you run into. Now, like kind of the next level after that, I do think unit testing is huge. Having even like a really basic understanding of how to write a simple unit test, I think that is like really important, and people should at least understand that, and then start to build on that as you go. Dependency injection is a good one. I don't like all the arguments that people get into over dependency injection and service locator versus dependency injection framework, all that stuff. I think that's noise. I think for most people it doesn't matter and we don't care. But understanding like why it's good to like pass dependencies in, kind of invert the control, why it's good to not just create everything on the fly. I think those are the types of things that are really beneficial. How dependency injection can maybe help testing as well. Um, and then knowing a framework that helps with that. Don't even necessarily have to know it well. Like Dagger, like I am not a Dagger expert, but I can, I can see Dagger, I can make Dagger work for me, but I'm not an expert. But I understand why we use it, and I understand the benefits that come from that. So I think that would be kind of maybe like another next level after that. Excuse me there. Let's see. Nassim here. Hey Nate, can you explain what agile development is? I see this term too often, and from my understanding, it's building scalable software with a clean architecture and adding small improvements. Oh yes. Over short periods of time, or is it that? Is it just that, or is it more complicated? No, like at its core, like I think that is a pretty reasonable summation of agile development. So again, I'm not going to claim that like I'm an expert on the definition of agile development, but um, when I think of agile development, when I think most people say agile development, they simply mean building software in this very like iterative fashion. By contrast, like years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, software was often built in what they called the waterfall model. So you might start up here and all the requirements, everything would be defined. Then all the architecture would be defined. And then you would just sort of like go down the waterfall and implement things. So if you got to a low level and realized there was an issue, you would have to go all the way back up and backtrack. And so it was this very slow process, and it was much harder to build quality software quickly. So agile, I think, is kind of the opposite of this. Agile is the idea that we're going to do things in small chunks. So often you might hear that as being like a sprint or a session, something like that. At the end of each session, ideally we have code that is in a deliverable state. It might not be an entire feature, maybe it's just a small chunk of that feature, but we're continuously in a deliverable state. We can reflect back on what's working, what's not working. We can improve our processes as we go. And just in general, it's this very quick, tight feedback loop where we can continually improve our processes and our software and continually ship good software to our users. So that's how I think of it. Now there is a lot of leeway in terms of how people specifically define it. What's a sprint versus a session? Are you using Scrum? Are you doing like a stand up? There's all these details, but in general, the key thing is that like tight feedback loop, I think, and continuous delivery as well. Yeah, I think that's a good question. When I was like first getting into my like first job, I had no idea when they're talking about like agile or Scrum and daily stand up. I had no idea what any of that stuff was, and was super confused for a long time. Honestly, I'm planning to talk more about that kind of stuff on the channel. If that's something that anybody else is interested in, leave a comment down below. Let me know maybe what types of specific questions you might have about kind of working in that type of environment. Let's see. Do you have any sites or documents that can find the best practice in Android development? So, I mean, for that, I think like Android developer, let's see, what is it? Just like the general Android developer site is probably like the best place to start with that. Not everything Google says is necessarily like what people are doing out in the real world, like at larger companies and stuff. But I do think this is a great place to start. And let's say I think they're trying to find some specific docs here. So yeah, so like if you go into Jetpack, I think starting here with some of the specific things around like, foundation, like why are some of these foundational things in place, like app compat, um, looking at architecture and some of the things like data binding, navigation, looking at the types of challenges they're trying to solve, I think are helpful. Um, I think another really good resource, again, on just, uh, oh, sorry, I lost my place. I'm trying to find the question again. Where did it go? Yes, here's the question again, just for everybody as well. So another place for sort of best like practices here actually is like the Udacity content. So some of it is a little bit out of date in terms of like, how much is it using Kotlin or some of the architecture components. But even some of the older stuff, the best practices are still pretty much the best practices. So all of the Udacity Android content, I believe, is free and is still a really good resource. And then like their newest free course, which is the like developing Android apps with Kotlin. Again, they're going to be getting into pretty much all the best practices there, like handling configuration changes, saving state, showing stuff in a list, making network requests, DB operations, all that really fundamental stuff. And I think those are the things to really focus in on. Once you kind of have a handle of those basics, I think then you're kind of at the level where you're start to see like when and where to maybe deviate from the Google guidelines. But yeah, I think sticking to sort of like the developer.android website guidance, material.io guidance for like the design side of things, and then some of like the Udacity courses that Google helped create. I think that's like a really good package for, getting at the Google recommended best practices, which I think are generally the ones we think of when we think of best practices on Android. Let's see here. Nat asks, for example, I want to work with Realm, Recycler View. Are there any best practices that I can find on the internet? So I'm not sure about Realm. I haven't worked with Realm in a while, and I'm not sure how many people are still using Realm. I'm sure it's probably more popular than I think, but I haven't heard a lot of people using it for a while. But for Recycler View, like there are definitely, again, more of these like Android developer resources. I think there are Android code labs specifically around Recycler View, which I'm trying to pull up right now. Oops. Recycler View. Well, I'm not sure if I'm coming up with that, but let me at least show this so that I'm not talking a blank screen. But like the Android code labs here, the Google code labs, if you filter by Android, you have tons of code labs here. So for like really specific things like a Recycler View, this is a great place to come and look to see if they have anything. Also, like just other YouTube channels are a great place for that. I think like Coding and Flow, Coding with Mitch, like both of those guys do a really good job of breaking down things like a Recycler View or other types of things like Viewed Page or whatnot. Also, like the Udacity free content, they talk about how to go through that stuff as well. So I think like that like free course on the internet route, free video course, I think that's definitely the way to go for a lot of that stuff. Let's see. Benny again, what would you say are the biggest improvements with DI? So I'm guessing like what the question is, like what are the improvements from like implementing DI? So I think when we start to think about writing code that we can integrate with dependency injection, we start thinking about inversion of control often, which essentially means like we're passing dependencies into our classes and maybe even like into our functions as opposed to creating those internally. A big reason why we do that is testing. If you have a couple of interfaces that you pass in, then when you test that, you can swap those out for test implementations of an interface. You're not coupled to whatever the concrete like runtime implementation might be. So this makes testing code easier. Another reason this is beneficial is because if you have different versions, different implementations of something for maybe like a release source set versus a debug source set, kind of the same thing applies. You can swap those out more easily when things aren't hard coded in there. It also makes development sometimes more easier. You can make things dynamic by relying on your dependency injection framework. It's possible to essentially change the runtime behavior based on what's injected into it. So I think like those are a couple of the big examples. It reduces some of the coupling in the applications where classes don't have to know as much about each other. It inverts the dependency, so you're passing things in to other classes that need them, which then means you can swap out the behaviors more easily. And then all of that makes testing a lot easier in general. Let's see. Yeah, good comment here from OneDev joining in. Mentions that like the best is learning by doing, but a good book for Android programming is the Big Nerd Ranch Guide. I 100% agree with that. So I was really lucky. I've been to Big Nerd Ranches, both their like Android fundamentals and their advanced Android boot camps. And through both of those, they basically work through the book, and the book is really good. They also have a book on Kotlin, which is really good. The people that write the books they're really nice. They're very friendly, whether online or in person. And so, yeah, I fully support Big Nerd Ranch. That's like one of the books that like I always recommend to people if you are looking to get a book to learn more. Yeah, we'll throw this up here too, just because. But yeah, I did write a book. I think I mentioned it briefly earlier, but if you want to learn more about Kotlin, yeah, I wrote a book. It'll be in the description for this video. You can check it out if you're looking to learn more about Kotlin. All right, we'll do a couple more here. Probably gonna wind this down at 90 minutes if we get there. Thank you for all the questions though. I'm glad. This is awesome. I talked too long. The question dropped off. So is everyone supposed to use a single activity now in multiple fragments? It's something I keep hearing about. Yeah. So this has become Google's sort of like recommended guideline. Particularly in the case of if you're using the navigation architecture component. And so this is one of those cases where the Google guideline it's good to be aware of. It's good to understand kind of why they have it, but you don't need to immediately switch over to it. So like I said, I think this guidance, it's not bad by any means, but I think it's most effective when you're using it in the context of using the navigation architecture component. So if you're using the architecture component and you have a navigation graph, then having a single activity and multiple fragments makes sense because navigating through all of those is handled for you by the nav graph. That said, so when Google says single activity, multiple fragments, I've heard them also say what they really mean is a few activities, and then each of those activities might have multiple fragments. And each of those activities might have a separate nav graph. And so what you can think of is if you have an activity or if you have an application that has like multiple distinct entry points into that application. So what do I mean by entry points? Typically what I mean here is like if you open up your application just by clicking on the icon, like that might be like the main entry point. However, like, do you have a deep link? Do you have a deep link that opens you up into like a very specific experience? So like in our application, we kind of have like the main like browsing experience that we open into by default. But then we also have like this editing experience. So if you had something like that where there's like two different ways to really start your app in practice, each of those might be a separate activity. And then any navigation within that might be multiple fragments. Now, all of that said, there's still nothing wrong at all with having multiple activities with multiple fragments, one activity and all the fragments, one activity and no fragments and just views. Like, I think this is an area where, like, as long as you have something that's working for you, there's no reason to change. But if you are sort of looking for, what is a new way of doing this, or like what's kind of what's just the recommended best practice, then I do think that using one activity with multiple fragments and using the navigation architecture component is a good way to go. It works out pretty cleanly, especially for like pretty straightforward, simple applications, which most of them are. And I do think that that's a great place to start. Okay, let's see. Noor asks, how to implement sequential approach for a particular requirement, like if something depends on another long task, besides asynchronous approach. I have to implement synchronous approach. How can it be? So let me read this again. How to implement a sequential approach for a particular requirement, like if something depends on another. So I think the question is here is like, how do I run multiple things sequentially that might be asynchronous? Yeah, like I think multiple things that are running one after another that depend on each other. I mean that is a tough challenge. So like one way to do that, you kind of mentioned besides the asynchronous approach, but like yeah, the first way to do that would be to like make essentially the whole thing asynchronous and then run the synchronous tasks one after another and then return the final result. Um, Another way to do it would be like using coroutines. You could essentially have multiple like suspending functions for each of these tasks, and then you could essentially await on the results of all of them, which is basically just a different variation on the asynchronous approach there. You could also do this with like a countdown latch where you basically start running the code. You say, all right, here's a latch like until these three things all complete, or until this latch gets to 0. We're not gonna like continue on with the execution of anything else. And then each time a task finishes, you can decrement the latch. That's really messy. I wouldn't recommend that. Like honestly, here the asynchronous approach. I mean, in general, like we're building asynchronous applications, so some type of asynchronous approach is typically what we're going to want here. So I'm not entirely sure if I may be understanding all the context here correctly. Nor I'd be happy to like continue this on more in the chat to get a better idea maybe of what it is specifically that you're looking for there. Um, but yeah, like in general, this idea of like how do we have multiple asynchronous things that we need to run on each other. Making them all asynchronous and returning a single result is one way. Coroutine solves this really nicely. RX Java could do this as well by kind of chaining multiple operations together and giving you a single result. Yeah, those are all valid approaches there. Okay, so yeah, with that, this has been much longer than I expected it to be, but thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. Like this type of all these questions and everything, this is exactly what I think is fun. I'm glad we did this. I'm gonna go ahead and call this a stream. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Let me know if you enjoyed this. If you would like to see this kind of continue on. And remember kind of that question of the week, what's your biggest challenge right now? Leave a comment down below and I will catch everybody in the next stream and the next video. Until next time, everybody, have a good weekend.